Pug and Book. Well, hello, Frank. Hello, and welcome to Pug and Book. We have a pug, and we have a book, so we're ready to get started. This is History of the World in 6 Glasses, Frank. I know you're terribly interested in this. Here, sniff that. Here, find that snack. History of the World in 6 Glasses by Tom Standage. It is a roughly chronological order history book of the 6 major drinks that have had a large impact on human history, mainly because they were safe alternatives to drinking water, which was necessary because, as we know, there are biological contaminants that make humans sick in water. And so these are the drinks that developed and became widely adopted that were relatively healthy alternatives. That you wouldn't die from drinking. You wouldn't get bacteria infections and that sort of thing from them. There are many other problems because of these drinks, and he goes into those in this history. It starts with beer. Beer is a drink that was developed alongside of the adoption of grain as the major crop that humans, or the first crop really that humans developed. The beginnings of agriculture about 10,000 BC. The use of grains, the discovery of how to treat grains to make bread, and then as of course how to store those grains. Moisture gets into the grain, and that produces a malt which releases sugars, and then that basically is very rudimentary beer. So once humans discovered beer, they were very happy about that. It's sweet, which is an unusual taste for humans to have access to. Also, beer was in the very first human written records. Beer and bread were the currency at times with which they paid laborers to get things done. And also, you could store the grains, you could store the bread, and therefore you could make beer at any time. It was a year-round drink. You could produce it at any point. Wine, also discovered at a similar point in history, could not be easily stored and transported until the discovery of pottery. Once pottery was discovered, then you could transport wine, you could store it for periods of time, and so wine became the next step, the next drink in this evolution. In the 1300s, thereabouts, the widespread use of distillation took place, and specifically, I believe it was in Spain. Come here, Frank. You're wandering around there. You're not paying attention to the book. Aren't you interested, Frank? So, distillation, spirits, brandy, scotch, all those kinds of distilled drinks came to be more common once distillation became a more regularly used technology. This also had to do with, or the spread of this had to do with the explosion in navigation that was happening as people from Europe began to go all around the world. They also discovered, or they found what the Arabs had already been doing with sugar plantations, and that you could make rum, and that began the widespread desire to make sugar and rum, and the need for slaves. And as we know, all the tragedies that have resulted in human history because of the sugar trade and the slave trade that came with it. Mainly the slave trade, obviously, more than the sugar trade. Then coffee came about in the Enlightenment. There were, not because of the Enlightenment, but because of coffee houses and places where people could get together and discuss ideas and thoughts without losing their sobriety. Coffee houses became very popular. Clerical work began to be a thing, and so you had an ability for people to be sharp, sober and awake throughout their workday, and coffee was a necessary ingredient for that. Then you have tea, which is one of the driving forces of the development of the British Empire, of all the overseas colonies that were acquired and developed so that they could buy and sell tea. And finally, the sixth drink is sodas and colas in the United States, developed starting with Coca-Cola and the variants of sodas based on that idea. And in the 20th century, obviously, that has become a very ubiquitous drink. And now that we have distillation and filtering of water as parts of this, now we have safe drinking water, and that is the seventh drink that's not actually mentioned in the title, is that now we have safe drinking water again, or for the first time in human history, without having to have intoxications or caffeine or any other drug along with them. And so we've come full circle on the desire to have safe drinking water. And our human history, I wouldn't say is determined by all these drinks, but the drinks have at one time or another made it easier for humanity to develop technologies, or maybe has stunted growth and caused wars and various other very negative aspects through our history. And so there's our summary of history of the world in 6 glasses. And Frank, why don't you come up here? Come over here one more time.
Let's say goodbye.
Thank you for joining us today on Hug and Book. Very Frank. Say goodbye. Oh.